Hi. We begin 1 Samuel 16 today and finally enter into the David story. If you haven't watched the last video, I really encourage you to do so before you watch this or the ones that followed. We went over a number of the issues you can see on this chart, most of which have no consensus among scholars, but scholars talk about them. We have to have some, at least, familiarity with the questions of authorship, time of composition, etc., to make sense of our story. But the most immediate issue is that scholars have divided the books of Samuel into three sections: the story of Saul's reign in the first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel, the so-called history of David's rise, or the HDR, as you can see at the top of the outline there, that starts somewhere around 1 Samuel 16, and I'll show you in a moment why the question mark there, and ends somewhere around 2 Samuel 8, or maybe 2 Samuel 5, etc., and then the succession narrative that follows, which we'll get to way later. So immediately there's a challenge to this, which we see if we look at our text on the left side, which is chapter 16 starts here with Yahweh saying to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him for being king over Israel." But of course, that follows directly not only from the previous verse, but from the previous passage, where Samuel had rejected Saul in the name of God and did not see him again until the day of his death, as we see in that previous verse. So chapter 16, as it begins, is tightly connected with not only chapter 15, but as we'll see with recollections of chapter 9, the beginning of Samuel's search for Saul, as well as other aspects of Saul's reign. Scholars can argue that whoever wrote the HDR or someone later edited these things to fit closer together. But of course, the tighter you fit it together to hide the seams, the harder it is for scholars to decide if there actually are seams or where the seams are. So it's a tricky business trying to do that, and we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to continue in chapter 16 here in the book of Samuel, noting these questions as we go. So as we do, another element of this, we're looking at this larger chiastic structure. This starts in 15:10. It doesn't start in 16:1. It starts in 15:10 with the metaphorical death of Saul the king and Samuel cutting off Saul's royal robe. And we'll match at the other end with the physical death of Saul and Jonathan. So our first scene in chapter 16 is in this element here, where the scene we're going to see is Samuel and Yahweh having the discussion about Saul and then the question of the replacement. And we'll actually get to David in the next scenes. Another element we're looking at here, and I showed this last time in a little more detail, are these three scenes, the one starting right here, the one that continues after it in 1 Samuel 16, and the one that follows after that with a little bit of a break there you can see in 17:10. David is a young warrior, and one could even argue that at the end of chapter 17, the beginning of chapter 18, perhaps a fourth one, where Saul is introduced to David as if he doesn't know him. And one of the challenges we're going to face here is, do we see these as three different sources who each had their own introduction that somebody later edited together and that scholars could see them as separate, the way I've color-coded them here? Or are we going to read them as if they're just part of the continuous narrative that however they were originally composed, somebody edited them into place expecting this would be a continuous story without having to have footnotes to say this came from a different author or a different time, etc. And as we'll see when we get to the second scene, the one coded in green here, there are many relatively easy means for connecting those and not having to refer to separate sources. Also, as we're looking at our chapter, although there are two episodes, the Samuel calling upon the sons of Jesse and finding the one that Yahweh has chosen, and then the servants of Saul finding someone, turns out to be David, who can console the king with the evil spirit that Yahweh has sent upon him. There are actually six little smaller scenes in terms of who's in which conversation. So we see in our first three verses Yahweh and Samuel, and then we see the Bethlehem elders and Samuel, and then we'll see Samuel and Jesse with the elders watching, maybe, it's not named, but probably, and then at the end of this scene, Samuel and David's brothers, as Samuel anoints David and then goes off to Ramah. And then in the next scene, we'll see Saul and his servants, and then Saul, the messengers, Jesse, and David as we go there. A couple of key things that are in this chapter before we look at the details. One is the comings and goings. A number of scholars have noted this, and here the issue isn't specific words in Hebrew, as we'll see in a moment with the idea of seeing, but movement. All the different elements of movement. And so I won't go through all those there. The blue ones are comings and the pink ones are goings, and that's the only color code there. But you can see there's a lot of coming and going there, and that has to do probably metaphorically with the leaving of Saul and Samuel from the scene and the coming of David into the scene here. But there's more to it, as we'll see that as we go. Another element that a number of scholars have seen, Fackelman and in his large commentary and others, is the key Hebrew word ra here, the verb to see. And it's used, as you can see, 7 times in these little sections, 3 times in this first episode and 2 times here. I'm sorry, 3 times in this verse, 5 times in the first episode and 2 times here. But note also a couple of other words for seeing here. Do not look, using the verb nubit here, and kash here for to look for. It could also be translated to seek. There's a lot of looking here, and it's ironic because Samuel's blind in the sense that Yahweh wants him to look not as humans see, but as God sees. And so we'll get to those things as we go. So let's go back and have the structure up here a little bit, and then we'll begin to look at our stories, and you can see some of the themes as we go. So it begins, Yahweh said to Samuel, and this is the first time they've talked in a while, and their final conversation. How long will you grieve over Saul? And as a number of scholars have noted, this echoes with the very beginning of 1 Samuel, Elkanah's question to Hannah, and I'll go back and we can go back and look at that there. Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? And as Polzin noted, and we looked at that when we looked at these early chapters of 1 Samuel, as an introductory scene in the entire books of Samuel, Polzin sees this as a parable about where the 10 sons represent 10 kings. And so Elkanah is asking, on behalf of Israel, am I not worth more to you than 10 kings? And so when we get back to our passage, we're in this new section here. The question is, let's not look back on Saul. Saul is from the past, and now we're in a new section. We'll see in this section there's no longer any question of whether Yahweh is for or against monarchy. We see that Yahweh is active in picking a king, and we see it in this very verse, and there's no question of, I'm doing this because you two people are too stubborn to have me as king, but somehow now Yahweh is in favor of monarchy, which may be one of the hints that this is from a different source, that someone is pro the Davidic monarchy, and the argument back in 1 Samuel 8 over monarchy at all has dropped out. So the question to Samuel is, let's get going. As Jobling notes below, Yahweh is impatient at Samuel's grief and is determined that Samuel will not a second time get a king that he can control. The word for grieve here, as I noted, links back there, and the word for rejected here, reversing 8:7, where the issue was the Yahweh saying to Samuel, they have not rejected you, Samuel, they've rejected me, Yahweh, from being king over them. And now it's shifted so that Yahweh has rejected Saul from being king over Israel. And recalling these other places, I won't look at every single connection, but I just want to highlight that for those who would suggest that there's a clean break here, and the rise of David to be king is somehow completely separate, is plainly not quite so simple, which is why there's no consensus on these things. The term for being king is the verb here, memelech here, and it's a key word back from chapter 15, and the last time will be at 16:7. So again, another element of how tightly linked this early first passage is with the one before. Fill your horn with oil. Karen here, this is the first time in Samuel, and it will be used a number of times we can see. That is the more traditional means for anointing a king, as opposed to the vial that was said to anoint Saul. So perhaps it's upping the ante in terms of ritual and tradition here, although whether the audience would have understood that is not clear, because it depends upon when the text was written and what other text they had. Again, one of those themes we looked at last video. So fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. A number of important things here. Okay, we know that David is the son of Jesse. That comes up in Psalms and other things, and in Isaiah, of course, in the stump of Jesse. And so there's a strong tradition of Jesse, but we know very little about him. We simply know that he's a Bethlehemite. And that's a tricky business, because biblical readers might go, okay, Bethlehem, David's from the same place as Jesus, and that's fair enough. But in the story we've seen so far in 1 Samuel, what is Bethlehem? It's not where Saul is from, and it's not in Judah. So let's look briefly at the map here so we can see. Here's the area where David is, here in Bethlehem, and Jebus, which will be Jerusalem. And so this is the section of David's area that he'll be focusing on. But if I go back up a couple of maps, going back up here. Here we are. Saul is in the area above this, north of this, here, and Bethlehem is down here. So Saul's region is here, and David's region is there. So if we go back to the map, the kingdom of David here, we can see, sorry for the confusion there, we can see that David's region is just going to be a little south of where Saul was. But when we think of the larger realm of Israel as a nation, this is all taking place in a tiny little area. So although we read the Bible as if these are grand kings like the Mesopotamian kings or Roman kings in the New Testament era, these are actually just like local chieftains fighting over small bits of territory. There's clearly no sense of how far the reign of either of these kings, Saul or David, would be. So what else might we know about him as a Bethlehemite? Let's jump ahead a little bit and jump to 1712, the only other place we hear anything about that. And there we hear David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah. So an extra piece of detail, not son of a Judahite, as my note has from Halpern. This reflects the fact that there was no tribe of Judah at the time of David's birth. And Halpern notes that in Judges 5, where there's a list of tribes, Judah is not one of them. And as we noted in the last video, there's little archaeological evidence for much settlement in or before the 10th century in this area. And so who an Ephrathite is, and what that has to do with what we know about Jesse and about David isn't 100% clear. The only other reference to it is Rachel's burial site. Back here in Genesis 35, we see here, Rachel died, she was buried in the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And that same equality of Ephrath with Bethlehem is used later in Genesis. We see it here way later. For when I came from Paddan, this is Jacob's summary, repeating what we just saw back in the earlier chapter. I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, and presumably that's the narrator inserting that is Bethlehem. So to say an Ephrathite of Bethlehem is an odd thing, because if Ephrath and Bethlehem are the same things, it's not clear how those relate to each other. But here we just heard simply that Jesse the Bethlehemite, which is to say he's not named as an Israelite and he's not named as a Judahite. So it's something neutral, perhaps, in relation to the house of Saul and what will emerge as the house of David centered in Jerusalem and Judah. And this is the first of those examples where the New RSV translate the key word for see as provided. So I've seen for myself a king among his sons. And note, there's a certain little mystery here. Yahweh has said to Samuel, I know who it is. And Samuel doesn't ask who it is. Samuel instead expresses, how can I go? And he's suddenly afraid of Saul, which is quite a thing. A number of notes here to be paying attention to. First, from Robert Alter, he notes, the prophet may claim the higher ground of divine authority, but it is the king who has the armed divisions. And Fackelman notes, the prophet now fears the prince more than the command of God. And then one more here from Halberstal and Holmes. Saul, who in his youth had to be dragged from hiding in the gear to become king, had now become a murderous threat to anyone. This is how supreme power can utterly remake the man who is allowed or compelled to wield it. But given all those esteemed commentators, there's still a mystery in the text of why Samuel is suddenly afraid of Saul. In the very last scene, Samuel spoke very boldly to Saul about how Yahweh had rejected him, and he didn't seem afraid in the slightest, and Saul did not seem murderous. In fact, Saul was the one who seemed trembling and hesitant and embarrassed and ashamed in the face of Samuel's expression of Yahweh's rejection of him. So why it is that Samuel's suddenly afraid of Saul when the idea comes that he'll actually be replaced isn't clear, but he's assuming that he will kill me. The first time we're hearing of this verb herg here in Samuel, we'll see it a number of times. And notice that it's ironic also becomes just after Samuel had chastised Saul for not killing the king of the Amalekites. So Samuel, who represented Yahweh in taking away the kingship from Saul for not being a killer, now is afraid that he's a killer of him, of his own prophet, not of the enemy king. So Samuel's final portrayal here is a very dark one, as he started off, of course, with chosen by God and with Hannah's song and the whole business that we saw early in the first chapters with Yahweh speaking to him, and it's all gone downhill now. That era is definitely coming to a close. Saul's era and Samuel's with it. And Yahweh said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. In other words, he's giving him a lying cover story. And that may be disturbing for people who come to the Bible thinking that lying is a sin or that God always tells the truth. And of course, it's not Yahweh who's going to tell the lie, but Yahweh is telling Samuel to lie. Plainly, the reason for him going is to find the son of Jesse that Yahweh has chosen. But he tells him to have the cover story of sacrifice. And Samuel will be obedient to Yahweh's lie, to take the heifer and and claim that he's come to sacrifice, although we won't see a sacrifice. So take the heifer, Eglath here, only here in Samuel and Kings, and there's a reference in Deuteronomy to sacrificing a heifer, but it's not clear how much the audience would have recognized that sacrificing a heifer was what would have been normal here. That's a pretty intense sacrifice as opposed to a dove or something small like that. I've come to sacrifice to the Lord here. And as Polson notes in the note below, the narrative distance between coming and going represents the ideological distance between appearance and reality. From God's spatial perspective in Ramah, Samuel goes to anoint. From the point of view of those at his destination, Bethlehem, Samuel comes to sacrifice. Polson very good on some of these things. So he says, I've come to tell him I've come to come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I name to you. Note that there's an ambiguity there. Isn't I will show you what you shall do the same as what you shall do is to anoint for me the one whom I name for you. So what's the point of the first phrase here, I will show you what you shall do, that expresses anything more than you shall anoint for me the one who I name? That's ambiguous here as we start. As Diana Edelman notes, the chosen ruse parallels the sacrificial meal in chapter 9, when Samuel had, here we can go back and look at that briefly, when Saul was coming up looking for the seer, and it said the people had a sacrifice in the town, and that Samuel would be there for the sacrifice, and you can't eat the sacrifice until the seer has blessed it, which of course turns out to be Samuel. And so there's an irony there. We're remembering when Samuel was the seer. And the word for seer, roe, is very related to the word here for seeing, and yet exactly what Samuel can't do is see what Yahweh wants him to do. So Samuel did what Yahweh commanded and came to Bethlehem, which is to say he only did that much so far, and there's a deep ambiguity there too. He plainly hasn't done all of what Yahweh commanded, because that will come afterward. So he came to Bethlehem, right over here. House of bread, it means. And the elders of the city. This is the first time we're seeing elders of the city in Samuel. It's the only time we'll see them in Samuel. They made an appearance in Joshua and in Judges. It's not clear what their role is. It seems implied, and like in most cultural contexts, that they're leaders of the city, but they don't seem to have any official role. And for some reason, they're afraid of Samuel. So a lot of fear here. Samuel afraid of Saul, and the elders of the city afraid of Samuel. And one might ask several questions here. Is, first of all, in Bethlehem, why would these people even know about Samuel? How much word is spread here from Gibeon and these places up here down to Bethlehem? True, it's not that far apart, but there's no email and they're separate towns, so it's not clear exactly what they would know, but they seem to know enough to be trembling. And we'll see trembling a number of times. We've already seen it a couple of times. As Walter Brueggemann notes, either Samuel is Saul's man come to forage in the unclaimed south, or he's not Saul's man, which puts them at risk with Saul. And that's at least his interpretation of it. As Edelman notes again, this contrasts nicely with the lighthearted, friendly reception of Saul as he approached Ramah. A little typo down there. So a lot of contrast between the picking of the first king and the picking of the second king. And they say, do you come peacefully, which is one word in Hebrew, shalom. You know, they're asking the question, shalom, and he says shalom. So that's the first part, that he's not going to ambush them, at least that's what he says. And he follows Yahweh's cover story, I have come to sacrifice to Yahweh. And then a very interesting thing happens. And the writer is doing some very creative things here with the reader's perspective, as well as the character's perspective. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And yet, what we hear is, and he sanctified Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Several important things going on there. We had heard the elders came to meet him, but we hadn't known that Jesse and his sons were there. So either that implies that Jesse is one of the elders, and he just happened to bring his sons along. Is that all his sons? Does that include the David, who we'll find out in a few verses is hiding amongst the baggage? I'm sorry, it was with the sheep. It was Saul who was hiding amongst among the baggage. David out with the sheep? We don't know here. But what Samuel had said is, sanctify yourselves, and then what the narrator tells us is that Samuel did it. What the sanctification consists of, we can't know. It literally means to make holy, but we can't know what ritual that might be, whether it's a washing or something else. But the fact that Jesse and his sons were there indicates that they were almost certainly part of the group that came trembling, although Jesse will not speak here. And so just to go down a couple more verses here so we can get to the central piece of this. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is now before the Lord. As Fackelman notes, he quite literally forgets that God has himself told him, I shall tell you who. The man who in Saul's hearing has so hammered the theme, listen to the voice of God, has forgotten this auditory guideline and allows himself to be dragged along by the force of visual impressions and by the conditioning of his mind. So Fackelman really nailing Samuel on how far he's fallen from his initial call. So when they came, he looked on Eliab, a name that means my God is Father, El for God and Ab for Father there, and thought, although it says he said, the narrator is not suggesting directly that we can read Samuel's mind. So he said, but not clear to whom. Surely, here, echoing the surely spoken by Agag just a few verses earlier, and again another connection between this scene and the previous one. Surely the Lord's anointed, Messiah here, is now before the Lord, or as Alter suggests translating it, before the Lord stands his anointed. And yet, not so. And so Yahweh turns to Samuel and says, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Notice it's a couple elements here. On appearance, which is to say his face, the first time we're going to see it, and we'll see it in 2 Samuel a number of times, or on his height, which recalls Saul, and as Brueggemann notes, Riley, suggests that Yahweh can remember when they both were misled by the appearance of Saul. For Yahweh does not see as Ha'adam, as humans see. They look by the eyes. Literally, they see by the eyes, but Yahweh sees by the heart. And we'll see, as Fackelman notes, recalling 10:1-8, which reveals what lies enclosed in Saul's heart, and we'll see later in chapter 17 what Eliab claims to see into David's heart. So that gets us started, and next video we'll see how the son of Jesse that Yahweh really wants ends up being anointed by Saul as Samuel as king. See you then. Bye-bye.